APUS government students, welcome to lecture 2.2. So now we're diving into the nuts and bolts of federalism. So we're going to break this down into three different pieces, and then we're going to talk about our first case of the semester. So again, when we talk about federalism, we're talking about that division of power between the federal government, the states, and what each receives. So we're gonna see there is three different ways in which this power can be divided: to the federal government, to the states, or shared between the states and the federal government. So as we start here, and what you're writing down, this is going to be the powers are going to be delegated to the federal government. So the Constitution is going to take, in essence, take some powers that the states had, and they're going to be delegated, enumerated, expressed to the federal government. So you can see some examples that are there. Among the biggest ones that I think that, jump off that slide for me is a Commerce Clause, and we'll talk more about that in lecture 2.3. We'll see just how big and important that is. And then you're seeing it. I mean, you're seeing the power of immigration. You're seeing that power of the federal government. You're seeing how some states are challenging that and have challenged that. And this, in terms of your lifetime, I mean, there were some challenges by some states by the way that Barack Obama was doing some things. And now you're seeing some challenges by some states in the way in which President Donald Trump is doing some things with immigration. But this is one of those enumerated powers given to the federal government. What then becomes a bit more controversial, as we'll see from our case here at the end of this lecture, is the idea of federal government powers only being written, enumerated, expressed. Is that it? And the answer we're going to see in our case at the end of today is no. They have some powers that we will imply into the Constitution. So it will talk about certain things, and then can we imply, well, does it also mean this? And you're going to see in some ways the Supreme Court's going to interpret that to say yes. And that's going to be controversial, but this is going to expand the powers of the federal government. All right? All right, so let's move on here. Let's go to the opposite end of that spectrum. Now we're talking about reserved powers. So of our first 13 states, these are going to be kept reserved for our 13 states that will evolve, obviously, to 50 today. All right? Now, interestingly enough, this was one of those things that the Anti-Federalists asked for, and we have it put into the 10th Amendment, one of those amendments of the Bill of Rights, the final one that's passed with the Bill of Rights in 1791, that talks about reserving powers to the states. All right, so you can see there's not a ton here. Regulate intrastate issues. Well, there's not really much of that today. Interstate, you're going to see, is the federal government. We just talked about in the last slide. Education, that's going to be a big one that you're writing down. Most criminal law matters, which probably surprises you. And then voting and elections. Voting and elections held by the states. All right. So anti-federalists like Robert Yates, Arbutus, Mercy Otis Warren. I mentioned one of our, famous females from back in this time. She was a notorious anti-federalist, talking about too much power going to this federal government. She is going to be a part of that anti-federalist movement too, and this idea of we want more power at the states, the local levels. All right, reserve powers. Concurrent, so these are going to be shared, federal government and state. So, taxing power, shared. All right, courts, shared. So these are things that both the federal government and the state can do. All right, taxing power, the state can tax you, the federal government can tax you. Federal courts, state courts, and we'll see that more in chapter 3. Supporting the health and welfare of our citizens. So this was a big deal during COVID, all right? Who really truly had this power? That was kind of a power play dynamic in terms of, what should Donald Trump do, when he was at the end of his term, and then what should Joe Biden do when he began his term in terms of COVID. And then roads, I know not super exciting, but, one of those that we see each and every day. All right, the supremacy clause. All right, so you can see that there. Let's just keep this really, really simple. For me, I really think about the supremacy clause. It seems like to me, and yes, there's exceptions everywhere, but it seems like to me that talking about it with concurrent power seems to fit, because when the federal government's doing something and the states are doing something, if the states do something that's contradictory to the federal government, they can't do that. All right. So this is going to be, I know you're like, what? Well, doesn't it just seem like that we have a unitary system because of the supremacy clause? The federal government gets to trump everything? Not necessarily. So this is really only to me in areas where they're both allowed to participate. All right. And you're going to see that in these areas, the states can't sort of hate on what the federal government's doing. I know it doesn't really make sense, but we're going to keep it really, really simple, and we'll go from there. I think it'll make a little bit more sense once we look at our final part of this lecture, and that is the case of, here we go, McCullough versus Maryland. All right, so our first case. And sometimes with our cases, I'm going to give you backstory. I'm going to give you kind of the facts. I'm going to let you kind of understand a little bit of the facts because they kind of help us understand what we need to know. And there's going to be some other cases just like, forget the facts. Let's just get to the holding and let's just understand what we need to know with it. With this first case, I feel like backstory is at least a little bit important for us to recognize. All right, so backstory facts. And I made up these numbers, all right? But they kind of give us context for kind of what was happening with what was going on here in Maryland. All right? So here's the story, all right? Maryland has their banks, just like our other states have their banks. We're talking about, the early part of our country's history, early part of the 1800s. All right, so these banks are smaller. They're just operating in Maryland. And so, again, I made up numbers. Let's just say that they're able to borrow money at 11%. So I pay them back what I borrow of this $3 million that they have, and then they get that money plus 11%, which is today really pretty healthy, but I'm just making up a number. All right. What's going to happen then in the beginning of our country's history is that the federal government is going to want to get involved in banking. All right. So these national banks. All right. So you're going to see that because they're going to be national banks, they're going to have more money to loan. There's going to be more people from more states. And because they're able to have more money, they're able to take on more risky loans. And they're able to then borrow that money at a lower rate. Again, so interest rates, what you borrow plus interest. So long story short, you want this to be as low as possible. All right, you want these to be as low as possible because that's the additional money that you're paying back. So obviously you can see that if these two banks are across the street from each other in Baltimore, for example, why not walk into the national bank? All right, because you're going to get an extra 3%, all right, in savings versus the state bank. All right, so the issue then becomes, once the federal government starts to operate in Maryland, Maryland and their legislature wants them out. So they're going to try and pass some laws and do some things and have some policies to get this federal bank out of there because they're harming, in essence, the business of the first state, of Maryland Bank that I made up. So let's get on with it. All right. So first of all, can we have these banks? All right. And what Maryland argues in court is, hey, find us the word bank in the Constitution. And it ain't there. All right. So that's the crux of their first argument. Hey, federal government can't make banks. Well, not so fast, says the Supreme Court. They say, well, it talks about a lot of things that they do have the power to do, which are in the Constitution, that are enumerated, that are expressed, like creating money, like borrowing. These are all things that are connected to banking. So why not let them have a bank too? Because they're doing all these things they're connected to it. So why not let the federal government have this power? Poof. First time in American history, we are implying powers of the federal government that they don't necessarily have written in them. All right? And there's going to be a catch-all phrase in the Constitution called the necessary and proper clause that is going to also be used with this. I need to add that into the notes, by the way, as I think about it. All right? Number two, there in gold. So Maryland says, fine, if they can have these banks, we're just going to pass laws that tax the heck out of federal banks so that their interest rates go above this 11% that I made up. No. Supremacy clause comes in now. Supremacy clause comes in now. All right. And that's where we've got state banks, we've got federal banks. To me, it kind of becomes, I don't know if we can technically say concurrent, but they're both in this business now that the supremacy clause is going to be used to say you can't hate on federal banks, states. All right. It's a big deal because it's a first use of implied powers. And I joke there at the end, and anti-federalists are going to be upset. They're going to throw up about this. All right. Now, I'm not saying that implied powers are bad. I'm not saying this case is bad, but we're going to see a huge growth of federal powers that anti-federalists would not like. So you can see here as I finish up this lecture here, you can see some things on the left that are expressed, and you can see some things that are going to be implied in the Constitution on the right. And that's lecture 2.2.